case you don't know me, my name is Anna Withers, and I'm the Farmer and Resource Development Manager for Springfield Community Gardens. And we are a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. We run 16 community gardens, 3 urban farms, a commercial test kitchen, and a community food forest. This workshop on the benefits of composting in agricultural settings is generously supported by the 2501 program from the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement. We're joined tonight by Justine Francesca. She's the board president of the Springfield Compost Collective. Thank you, Justine. And I'll hand it over to her in a moment. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We definitely encourage you to ask questions throughout the night. Please do not be shy about this. It helps us make sure that we're tailoring the content to you. Just be sure to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and keep that separate from the chat. You're welcome to add comments in the chat box, but it helps me keep track of the questions and make sure we've answered everything as we go along. And then also, once you leave the workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a survey, and that survey is used in our reporting to the USDA, and it also provides meaningful feedback so that we can make our workshops better in the future. So we really appreciate if you can just take a couple minutes. It's very short. Just take a few minutes to fill it out after the workshop. And we should have this recording added to SCG's YouTube page by the end of the week. I'm going to put links to our social media, Springfield Compost Collective social media, our YouTube channel. Everything will be put into the chat. And if there's something missing there that you would like linked also, just let me know and I'll add that. So I think that's it from me. Thank you all again for being here tonight. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to Justine.
Okay, awesome. Looks like we have a very intimate group of folks. So please feel free to ask your questions. I love answering questions. So let me go ahead and share my screen here so we can get started. Okay. Everything look good on your guys' end?
Looks great to me.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for being here with me for the benefits of composting in agriculture settings. I really appreciate Springfield Community Gardens asking us to come and put on these workshops. We love teaching them and we love being in partnership with the community gardens. They're doing incredible things for the community, as some of you may know. And if you don't know, I highly recommend checking out their gardens and all their programs. It's pretty incredible what they do. So a little bit about myself. That is a picture of me and my 3-year-old son. I am a mama that is currently farming 3.6 acres in the foothills of California. I went to Missouri MSU for Sustainable Agriculture and Plant Science. I have been vegetable farming on and off for 10 plus years. And I've done multiple certifications. I've worked for the community gardens, and then I've started a nonprofit, Springfield Compost Collective. One of my biggest certifications that I hold dear to my heart is the Dr. Elaine Ingham Soil Food Web certification, where I gained a lot of my knowledge about more in-depth relations with the soil and proper compost making. A little bit about Springfield Compost Collective. We are a 501c3 nonprofit as well. Our slogan and simple mission is that we compost food scraps, regenerate soils, and do all this while building mindful waste management in Springfield. And we do this through providing a food scraps pickup program for residents and for businesses, and also by operating a free community compost bins throughout the city. We do free education workshops, and then we offer zero waste pickup for events. And this is where we go in and assist local events to try to think as mindfully as they can about the waste that they produce and we set up zero waste stations and then haul off their food scraps and compostables at the end of the event. We are also solely a volunteer organization. We have one paid employee who does the pickup route for us, but the rest of it is operated by volunteers. Okay, so let's go into the composting side. Again, please feel free to ask any questions as we go, and then I will answer them for you. I love the questions that you have, so please put them in the Q&A. So we're going to talk about why composting. How does composting benefit you on your farm? I want to hit on the science behind the pile. How I teach about composting is I want to tell you how the science works with composting, so that when you come up to the pile and you say, oh, something's wrong, or it's not doing this or that, you can remember that, oh, it's not decomposing because of this reason, or I mixed up this mixture incorrectly, and so I need to add carbon or nitrogen. So I want to teach you the true basics behind composting so that you can come up with the solutions yourself. I'm going to teach you about microorganisms and what they do in the pile, and then also the difference between hot and cold composting. And then since this one is a little bit more focused on in agriculture settings, we're going to do composting best practice in those settings. So different types of styles for your farm. And then these also can be applied to your home. We'll go over some, backyard composting styles as well. And then we will finish with how to tell good versus not so good compost, how to order compost, and then application. This last one has become a lot more popular recently, so I made some videos to show you of what to look for in good and bad compost. So let's get started. Okay, so why compost to begin with? Back when I first started gardening and farming 10 years ago, a lot of farmers did not compost. It wasn't worth their time and effort, what they thought. And so a lot of their material was just hauled off, or they just pile it up somewhere. But in the last, I want to say 4 years, maybe 5 years, it's turned around. A lot of farms have started to realize the value in composting their plant material. They've realized that the plant cycle has more than just, 2 stages. It has a third stage where you can use it to make compost. And so there are a lot of information out there about composting now for a farmer, but it makes me really happy because in Midwest, farmers spend nearly $4 out of every $10 on the cost of growing corn on fertilizer. And fertilizers are just getting more and more expensive. Same for the home grower. Fertilizers for your plants are just getting more and more expensive as well. And when you start making compost and applying that to your farm or your garden, you're going to cut your use of fertilizers. And it also cuts your reliance on the repeated application of fertilizers, which will help you in the future as well. And we'll learn about how compost works and how it creates life in the soil and a little bit down the road in this workshop. So compost also is more than just fertilizer. It can hold 5 times its weight in water when you have a good quality compost. It helps to suppress weeds and pathogens, and it improves the CEC exchange, which creates a better relationship between the microorganisms and the plant. It makes it to where the food that the plant needs is easily available to the plant. And it helps to filter out contaminants. So even if you're looking at compost as just a way to fertilize your land, it's also providing all these other things for you. And then one of the things that I really appreciate in the use of compost is that it's really better for our community. Compost helps to close the food loop in the community where, the food that's produced on your farm is going out to the community, and then your waste is staying on your farm, and then you're turning it back into compost to then go back onto your land. So you're closing your food loop, and you have less reliance on outside sources on your farm, which I think is really important for financial costs and for sustainability on your farm. Plus, it sequesters carbon, and it is a solution for some of the climate issues that we're having right now. One of the things that I, as far as cutting costs, something that I really like to tell the farmers is that if you think about, like, later on in this workshop, we'll learn about turning compost, and say the beginning farmer takes an hour to turn your compost pile. If that's by hand, it should be less time than that, but 1 hour, right? And say you pay them $15 an hour. It may take 6 turnings altogether for the life of that pile before you get a finished product. And so, 6 hours at $15 is $90 you spent on a product that is way higher quality than a lot of compost that you're going to get in your area. So the average compost that I was looking at in Missouri right now before I got on this workshop was anywhere between $40 and $74, for a good quality compost. And so that's just for 1 yard. So it really pays off in the end, I believe, to really start producing your own compost for your farm. Another reason of why you want to compost on your own farm or at home is that it guarantees a good quality of compost. You don't have to worry about whether the compost is contaminated with weeds or herbicides or pesticides. You're going to be growing your native microorganisms, and earthworms will be able to get into your compost. I don't know if you've ever kind of notice that when you buy compost from the stores, there's no earthworms in there, and it's just not an environment that they can live in a commercial facility. But at your house, they can do that. And earthworm castings are very valuable and really great for the soil and for your plants. So the cost of compost is going up. It is going up like crazy. So starting this habit of building your own now is going to be very good for your farm. Like I said, it builds soil and sequestering carbons. It helps to be more self-sufficient on your farm. And if you're a large farmer that has chickens or sheep like we do, or ducks, it is a form of waste removal. It's a solution for it, which we'll talk about later on as well, where if, say, you have a few animals that have passed away, now you have to take care of this waste that you just got on your farm, and composting can do that. And I will teach you how to do that in this workshop. It is a safe solution for that. And then you're using all parts of your plants, and you're keeping them from truly wasting when you're composting on your farm. So what is compost? Well, compost is a decomposition of organic matter in an aerobic and oxygen setting, which is the most important part here. True composting is in an oxygen setting. In nature, in the world around us, decomposition and composting is happening all the time, right? Just recently have we done this thing where we've taken compostables and put it into an anaerobic setting, a landfill, and that setting is where it creates, toxic gases and methane, which is contributing to global warming. So we want to get composting and organic materials back into a setting where oxygen is available for it to be composted properly. So it is the natural recycling process that gives life and energy back to the earth. So these are the 4 key ingredients for successful composting: carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen. Okay, carbon is going to be your brown materials in your pile, your mulch, your leaves, your dried, your cardboard, newspaper, paper, what else do we have? Anything that's your dried grass, anything that is brown is your carbon material. Nitrogen is the material that is green and has moisture to it and was, recently alive. So that's your plant material. That's also like your manure is a high nitrogen source. So carbon materials, They are the energy source, the food source for microorganisms, just like carbohydrates provide an energy source for us. So the reason why these four elements here are so important is because what we're doing in composting is we're feeding microorganisms. We're creating this perfect stew for them so that they can come in and reproduce and eat up all of our organic matter very quickly to turn it into soil compost. And so these are the elements that they need to be most successful. Water, let's go nitrogen. Nitrogen provides the proteins that microorganisms need to break down the carbon for growth and to reproduce as rapidly as possible. Water, everything needs water and around us, and microorganisms, they need water as well. They need to maintain a coating of water around them to function properly and to move about the organic material and to do what they need to do. Without water, they can go dormant and they also can die. And then oxygen, one of the key components in composting. A lot of people forget about oxygen. You have to have oxygen to have the aerobic bacteria that you need, the proper bacteria that you need to break down compost, to give you a high quality, very earthy, healthy compost. Anaerobic bacteria will come into your pile, which are not the ones that we need in composting. They're the ones that create odors and create toxic gases. They will come in if your pile does not have oxygen. And we incorporate oxygen into the pile by turning it. Here's a good image here, a good example of why it's so important to have the proper amount of oxygen and water in your pile. So if it's dry, you can see that you have low microbial activity in your pile. So your pile's not going to decompose very quickly if it's very dry. Now, if it's too wet, you'll see this is where you start bringing in microorganisms that are going to make your pile go anaerobic and become smelly. And at that rate, sometimes the pile doesn't even decompose very fast when it's too wet. But in the middle is where you have an optimal moisture amount, which is about 45 to 55% moisture content. And you can tell this by, scooping up your compost and squeezing it as hard as you possibly can, and you will have like 1 or 2 drops coming out, and you're at a 45 to 55% moisture content. And at this level, you have the highest diversity of microorganisms in your pile, so it's going to decompose the fastest. Why is all of this important? Why do we even care about microorganisms or moisture or oxygen and having the right, mixture of carbon and nitrogen? This is the image right here, the soil food web. And it's becoming more popular. When I started teaching this workshop, a lot of people didn't even know about the soil food web. I asked my professors at MSU after I had graduated and done all these certifications if they had heard about the soil food web, and they had not, because it's a very recent discovery by Dr. found out that the soil is alive just like everything else is on this earth, and that it has this web of microorganisms that work together right next to plant roots, and it works with the plant to provide the plant the exact nutrients that it needs to survive. And so what we're doing with compost is that we are growing the microorganisms that thrive in the soil food web so that we have the healthiest soil and the healthiest plants. So it starts by growing the proper bacteria, the fungal networks, the nematodes. Poor nematodes have such a bad rap because, the population of beneficial nematodes in the soil outweigh and outnumber largely the amount of the root feeding nematodes, the bad nematodes. But for some reason, everyone knows the bad nematodes and they get so scared when you say nematode. The bad nematodes only come in your soil when your soil food web is off, when you don't have a correct balance of microorganisms in there. It allows the bad guys to thrive. And compost brings in the correct balance so that you don't have just the bad guys winning. So remember that nematodes are beneficial. Nematodes are good for your soil, and there are many types of nematodes. In this workshop today, we're not going to go super in depth about the soil food web or microorganisms. We have done workshops in the past with Springfield Community Gardens, and I highly recommend going on their YouTube channel and searching for those and watching those if you're interested in a more in-depth soil food web course. And then you can also reach out to the Compost Collective, and we could arrange something as well as doing a workshop that's specifically based on soil. So just know that, just like the animal food web where, the mouse eats the grass and then the hawk eats something eats the mouse and then the hawk, and there's this web of life. The exact same thing happens in the soil food web. And it really starts with the microorganisms in the soil. So, before I continue, do we have any questions right now?
Nope, you're covering things very thoroughly so far.
Great. If you can't tell, I really like talking about compost and soil. Okay, so this next slide is going to just briefly go over how it all works. So some of you may know the plant uses the sunlight, right? It photosynthesizes and it creates carbohydrates, sugars. And a plant will share 80% of its sugars with the microorganisms in the fungal networks in the soil, which is what this diagram is going to show you. So it takes in the sun, it creates carbohydrates, and then it puts those carbohydrates into the soil where it's going to put it out in hopes that a fungal network or a bacteria are going to create a relationship with it. Right. And so what's happening is the plant feeds the fungal network its sugar that it needs. And in exchange, the fungal network will go out and get the nutrients that the plant needs in the form that the plant can healthily take up, and it feeds the plant. This relationship right here is something that Dr. Elaine figured out, that we don't need to interject with synthetic fertilizers. The plant creates relationships in the soil with these organisms and with this fungal network to do it all itself. And compost helps that relationship even further. Now, one thing is that bacteria, they're living in the soil, moving around, millions of them. And there is this relationship with bacteria where the nematodes, they have to come and eat the bacteria up so that what they excrete out of them is nutrients available to the plant. And so there is a cycle in the soil that has to happen for the nutrients to be available in the form that the plant needs. And then as you all saw, like when this relationship happens right here, it builds soil. This is what this is saying. Like when this relationship is healthy, this image on the left means that the soil is going to be healthier. It's going to take in more water for the plant. And it's going to make it to where we're going to have less flooding on our farm, which is an issue in our garden, versus the image on the right where we take that away. We lose the water holding capacity in our soil because the microorganisms have died and they're not creating soil aggregates anymore. They're not creating that structure in the soil because they are the structure and so there is this circle that has to happen in the soil, and composting and putting it on your soil is what helps that. This image right here was provided by Kiss the Ground. I did a Kiss the Ground workshop. I became a soil advocate through their program. I don't know if you've all have heard of Kiss the Ground, but they're a platform for training soil advocates and giving soil advocates the information and the education that they need is really great, and I highly recommend them and looking into that if you want to learn more. So Let's go into hot compost versus cold compost because there is a difference. In this specific workshop, we're going to focus more on the on the hot compost side, especially because we're going to kind of gear it towards agriculture use. But there are pros and cons to both. Hot compost is going to create compost faster. You can get compost within, oh my gosh, I've seen compost created in a matter of 4 weeks, but it can take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, 1 to 2 months. In cold composting, it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to take 6 months to 2 years. Cold composting is kind of like, it's what my mom did when I was growing up, where there's a compost pile all the way in the back of the yard, and you went back there and threw stuff back there once in a while. And maybe in a couple of years, you would go and find some really nice soil. So it's less labor intensive, but it takes a lot longer to get compost versus a hot compost. And then the hot compost, the temperature that we achieve in the hot compost, it helps to kill pathogens in weed seeds. And we'll talk more about that as well. Hot compost allows you to compost animals and manures properly. And then it's all about feeding the aerobic bacteria. Cold composting, you cannot do meat and dairy, but there have been studies showing that it can conserve nitrogen over the long period of time. It does not kill weed seeds and pathogens. You can get some nutrient loss through extended exposure. So cold composting, if you ever seen those compost piles that they may be really high, and then when you go to harvest it, it's like you just lost 3/4 of your compost pile. That is well known with cold composting because it sits there for a long time and it will just compost into the soil. And then lastly, cold composting, it can be anaerobic sometimes because it can get condensed down and a lot of pressure in it, and that pressure will push out oxygen in your compost pile. So we were talking about temperature and how that, is a big difference for cold and hot. And I just wanted to hit on this right here. It's extremely important when we are composting in a hot composting setting to monitor your temperature. We are looking for 135 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 days to keep weed seeds and pathogens away. This is the organic composting standard. And then you have to turn your compost within so many days and keep it at this temperature for those type of standards. So if you go out to purchase organic compost and it has the official OMRI or the official USDA certified organic, it is worth the cost for an organic or OMRI certified compost because they had to go through strict regulations to get it that way, which means you should definitely not have weed seeds or pathogens in your compost. Now, compost thermometers are, I forgot to bring one up here. There are a very long thermometer with the top of looking like this, and you stick it into your compost pile and make sure you want to stick it into the very center, and you take a reading. And it's very important to monitor your pile because you want to know if you're reaching these appropriate temperatures. Turning your pile helps to maintain high heat, and it also makes sure that you're getting oxygen to all the good bacteria all over your pile. And we'll talk a little bit more about why it's so important to turn later on. And then watering helps to maintain the temperature and allows for microorganisms to reproduce, which increase the temperature. So a lot of times people will ask me, well, how does a compost pile even get so hot? How is that possible? And the best way for me to describe it without being too sciencey is that there are billions of microorganisms in composting and you are growing them. And so what's happening is it's very similar to like if you go outside for a run and you're jogging, or if you're dancing and you start to sweat and get really hot. That's what's happening with these microorganisms. They're inside the pile. They have the perfect ratios to reproduce really quickly and eat. And when they do this really, really quickly, they're putting off heat and gases that are going to warm up the pile. And so that's the simplest way for me to describe it to you. There is there can be a downfall with hot composting, and it's that it can get too hot. If your pile goes over 165 degrees, one, congratulations. That means you're doing it. You have created a very good ratio. You're doing great. You just need to get in there and you need to turn your compost pile as fast as you can. Because if you reach 175 degrees and over, that is at the temperature where you start producing gases that are not safe for the environment, and they're not safe for your compost pile. So an example is mulch facilities and composting facilities. When they have these huge piles of compost and mulch, it can get up to 180 degrees in those piles very quickly, and they can catch on fire because at those temperatures, the bacteria and they start to create alcohol. And as soon as, say, they go in there and they put their truck in there to turn it and it exposes it, a little bit of oxygen to it, it's going to catch on fire. And sometimes it even happens when you don't expose oxygen to it. So that's why it's really important that we keep it below 165 degrees. And some people, I will tell you all the time, people don't believe me that they can get hot compost, but I promise you, they can get hot compost. When I was working for the community gardens, and I love this part, I was teaching the garden leaders how to make compost, and none of them believed me that they could do this. And then as they started doing it, because I gave them all compost thermometers and they learned how to do it, I would get pictures from them saying, look at my compost pile, it's 130 degrees. And they would just be absolutely like freaking out because they did it. It's a lot easier than you think. And I'm going to teach you how to do that. Now, if you're a farmer tuning in and you're going to be building a big pile of compost, you're going to need the bottom thermometer, which is one that can be calibrated, and it's much bigger for larger piles. The top compost thermometer that on this presentation is for home composters or smaller compost piles, and you can get these on Amazon. You can get the small one on Amazon, but the large one you will have to order from Rio Temp directly. Or you can just order the small one directly too, which I recommend as well. Okay, any questions?
Not at this time.
Okay, wow, you all know everything. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so building the pile. There is a layering system to how to build your compost pile. And this image here is more geared for like at-home composters. I have another image that's for farmers. But the biggest thing you want to take away from this is a layering system. It's not just throw it all. I mean, you can throw it all in there if you want, but you really got to mix it up and you got to make sure that you have it covered. But this is what's going to be the most doable for people at home and even in a farm setting is that you're going to have a bottom layer, which is, I like to use cardboard, and then I like to put about 4 to 6 inches of mulch on top of that. And then I can start piling my nitrogen in. And so my nitrogen goes on top of that, and then my leaves go on top of that. And then maybe I'll put some finished compost on top of that, just to inoculate the pile to get it going. And then I'll water it all in. So you see this layering system here. We have dry, wet, green, a little bit of manure or soil, water it in. And then we do it again, dry, wet. Now, you don't have to do this all at once. If you want, if you're a farmer, you will have the product to do it all at once. If you have a big day where you're cleaning out your beds, or even a gardener, you're cleaning out your home gardener beds, then you have all the product to make a proper compost pile all at once, which is really great. And I recommend doing it that way. But if you're just composting your food scraps, it's okay to build it slowly. The biggest thing is that you always cover it with a carbon layer, or which is your brown layer. You never ever have your food scraps exposed to the elements, or your nitrogen exposed to the elements. One is because when nitrogen just sits on top of the pile, the gases will just, evaporate. I mean, that's what happens when you just let, things sit out, your green material just sit out, it's going to turn into brown, right? You're going to off gas your nitrogen. So same with this, you want to always cover your food scraps. And you don't want to be a vector for any sort of like, smells or insects or animals. And if you keep your food scraps or nitrogen covered with, 2 to 4 inches of mulch or leaves, you're less likely to have an animal issue. Now, composting, there is a requirement for the size. It needs to be, technically, it can't be smaller than 3 by 3 by 3. So 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. But I always like to tell people that I really like the minimum to be 4 by 4 by 4, which is like your average pallet size. And that's why I like to build home composting structures with pallets. The reason why this is because they found out that if you can keep your compost pile at a 4 by 4 by 4, now this is when you build it all the way up and you've stirred it up, and now you're going to let it sit there for a little bit and decompose while you're checking it and airing it out. At 4 by 4 by 4, it's going to be able to protect itself from winter. It's going to be able to protect itself from rain, and it's going to be able to keep its temperature regulated. This was what they found out after, a lot of studying compost piles. So this is the ideal height and width and length. You don't have to do it, but because, as you're throwing your scraps in, you're not going to get to 4 by 4 instantly. Just know that, like, if you build out your area, it's best to build it a minimum of 4 by 4 by 4. And then chopping your food scraps up. You like to have your pieces anywhere between, no bigger than 4 to 6 inches. The smaller you can put your pieces into the compost pile, the faster it will heat up, and the better your compost will be. So trying to really make sure your food scrap is, cut up a little bit. And you can achieve this by just getting in there with a shovel and breaking it up, or like we have machetes that will just, cut up the food scraps as well, or, all of our green material.
Hey, Justine, quick question for you.
Yeah.
Does straw count for the carbon layer?
Straw is a carbon layer, yes. Now with straw, you want to be careful because maybe you've all seen it, but when straw gets wet, like if you have a straw bale and it gets wet and then you open it and you see that there's like a bunch of bacteria in there and it can get a little smelly. That's because straw has the ability to really like push out oxygen, because when it gets wet, it compacts really easily. So I don't like to use a large amount of straw, but it's good for compost. Like my friend who makes the best compost and compost tea, he always puts a little bit of straw in his compost because it feeds a specific microorganisms. It helps, like, the more diversity of carbon and nitrogen materials you put in your compost pile, the better your compost is going to be. So if you use leaves and you use some straw and you use wood chips, all that together is going to make a really excellent compost versus if you only used wood chips or if you only use straw. So a mixture is definitely going to be best. But yes, straw is okay. And small amounts. So this next one is a windrow for a farm. I don't know if there's any farmers on right now, but if someone views it in the future, I want you to know that it is okay to compost your animals and your manure on the farm. And this is the way to do it right here, is through a windrow style composting system. You can also use a static aerated compost system, which we will go over later on here. But this is an image that kind of shows you how you want to do it. The most important thing with this style is that you have a 2-foot carbon layer over the entire windrow, and that your nitrogen layer, which is going to be your animal product, is going to be in the center with layers of your carbon material in between each one. Okay, you just need a lot more carbon material because animal product is a high nitrogen component. Right, there's different levels of nitrogen, which we're going to go over. Just know that animal product is the highest. So you need to have the most carbonous materials to break it down. example, I had a chicken that passed away and I put it into the center of my compost pile and it decomposed in 1 week. 1 week. Now, that is like a very proper way, I feel, to take care of that situation. And so I would love to see more farmers being able to do that themselves. You can apply this as well to large livestock. You just have to dig a little bit more. You have to dig a little bit into the ground because they're bigger and you don't want to make the pile too high. Like it says right here, a maximum feet is 6. You do not want to go any higher because you can risk overheating the pile and having an issue. So, okay, we're talking about, I just said about ratios. This is another thing you'll see when you look up composting is, ratio this and ratio that, and what is your ratio? The thing with this is don't get yourself too psyched up about, is my ratio correct? The biggest thing to know is that it's just kind of to understand the different type of ratios the materials hold. So your coffee grounds, like it says here, 20-1, right? Your vegetables, 15 or 20-1 is kind of average. Now with your carbon materials, they do vary. Like leaves, anywhere between 60 and 100-1. But wood chips are going to be very high, like 400 to 500 to even 1,000, because they're big chunks of wood. So their carbon matter is higher. Their ratio is higher. So just know that if you put coffee grounds only thing you put in your pile is coffee grounds, and the only thing you put in there is wood chips, it's going to take a long time for your wood chips to decompose, right? You could do tons of watering and flipping, and it will go up in temperature and then it will go down. And you may look at your final result and say, wow, I only got a little bit of compost, but I still have tons of wood chips in here. That was because your material that you use, your green material, had a lower nitrogen ratio than what your carbon material had. So this is why I tell people it's really important to have a mixture of carbon material and nitrogen material, so you get these ranges in the ratios. So I hope that helps. Is there any questions on this, on what I've said so far?
Maybe people are embarrassed to ask questions because this is a lot of information coming at us. Put any in the chat, but I love it. Every time we have a composting webinar, I learn more and more and more. I think it is so important, like knowing that it's not taboo to ask about composting animals or manure or things like that. It's an important part of it, and it's a great alternative for processing your waste. So
yes.
Yeah, but feel free to go right ahead. And again, we just encourage anyone listening to ask questions. There's no nothing that's off limits.
Yes. Yeah. And, I think we're coming into a new world now where people are more accepting of the composting of, different types of manures, different types of like biosolids, human waste, animal waste. And so it's going to be really important for us to know how this works. So yeah, ask away. So composting, oh, let me turn this down. Oh no, go back. Composting best practices here. I'll do that in a second. Okay, so checking temperature, which you just learned, doing that 2 to 3 times a week. Location, so trying to find a good location for your pile. The biggest thing is that we don't want out of sight, out of mind. Like I said, growing up, my mom's compost pile was in the very back of the yard, and we barely used it because she didn't see it very often. And she didn't want to walk all the way back there to take the food scraps. So keeping your pile close where you can see it, because it's alive and you want to treat it like your garden or like a pet that you have to take care of. You're growing microorganisms in there, and it needs attention. So this little video here I'll show you is a video of the market garden. This is an old video when I lived in Springfield, so it's, you know, a few years old, but I love their setup for their composting system, which it may look way different now, but I loved how close it was to the garden, but still at a distance where it didn't feel like it was like, you know, in the garden way. And their setup that they did for their farm worked really well for them. So I'm going to go ahead and show this video for you.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much still the same. It's gone through a few iterations, but it's definitely still the three bins, three sections there.
Okay, great. Awesome. I don't know if you can hear the sound on this video or not.
It might be turned down really low.
That's okay. Well, I could just turn it down then. So yeah, they're showing you, you know, they have a weed area where they store their weeds to let them dry, like the bad weeds that you want to let dry out, you know, Bermuda grass or something that you're nervous to put in your pile because it might grow. You could totally let them dry out in the sun. And then like I was saying, I like how this one has access to two sides, so you could have more people around the pile helping you. And then you can kind of see all their food scraps they have just right next to it. And it's right next to the shed, which makes for easy tool access. You know, and because it's so visible, you are more likely to keep it clean and like neat and more likely to take care of it. And then look how close it is to their garden. So they can take their finished product directly into the garden with ease, which is really important as well. So yeah, I just really like their setup there. And I love how they do that in the city, and it still looks beautiful and it doesn't smell. And it's a really great example of proper composting. Okay, so turning as much as you can, at least once a week is great. Now, if you're a farmer and you're doing high nitrogen products, you're probably going to have to turn it more because you're going to have to go out there and check the temperature. And if your temperature is hovering at 160 or higher, you got to go out there and you got to turn it again. So you have to keep turning it every time it gets over 160, and eventually it will, you know, it will go down because every time you turn it, you're putting oxygen into your pile, which is making your microorganisms super happy and making them work to decompose your organic material in the pile. So yeah, turning it, and that's because we don't want anaerobic bacteria in the pile. Now, if you turn your compost pile and now you notice, oh, I have food scraps exposed, then you just need to get some more leaves or carbon material and cover them up again. There is a proper way of turning, and I have a video to show you. But if you can't do the proper way of turning, you know, just at least getting out there with your pitchfork and lifting it up and, you know, turning it up a little bit and stirring it up a little bit is better than nothing. The biggest issue with, you know, the light stirring is that you may get anaerobic bacteria at the very bottom of your pile, and anaerobic bacteria, they can move and grow and like kind of move up into your pile. So once in a while you will want to go and like actually, you know, move the bottom, move it all around as much as you can so you don't get these pockets of anaerobic bacteria, which I will show you what those look like here. And then moisture, keeping it moist. Now where I live in the foothills of in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and it's very dry here. It doesn't rain from the end of May until November. So we have no rain in the summer months, and we have to do special things to keep our compost pile and our ground wet. And one of them is, applying compost to the ground, but covering our piles. And so how we cover them, I use like a tin roof, and I cover my wooden structures with a tin roof to keep the sun from baking the pile and try to hold in moisture. You can also put a tarp over it, but you don't want the tarp to be laying directly on your compost pile. You want some sort of air movement in between there. So what I do is I roll up chicken wire or some cattle panel wire, and I put it on the top of my compost pile. And then I lay my tarp over that, which allows some airflow movement to happen. And what else? Oh, now in Missouri, you can have an issue with too wet. Like if you had weeks and weeks of rain and you go out there and you look at your pile and you're like, oh my gosh, this is sopping wet. That is probably a good time. Like if you see weeks and weeks of rain coming, you need to cover your compost pile, because when you get it too wet, you have to add in more dry carbon materials to dry it out. And so that means you're going to be throwing off your carbon ratio. So you're going to have to add in more nitrogen. So you're just going to have to really work with your pile a little bit more. So, covering it is definitely a good idea, but it's not something that you absolutely have to do. But you absolutely have to do is cover your nitrogen. You can't have any food waste exposed ever, because this is what gives composting a bad rap right here. It's just leaving it out for flies or animals to get into. And also, it's not proper composting. Like a pile of nitrogen and a pile of carbon separate isn't going to do anything. They're not going to decompose properly. They're not going to give you the final product that you want. But together and layered in nicely and all covered up appropriately will. So please always cover your nitrogen, your green materials with carbon.
Question about covering. So yes. At a different SCG kind of meeting or training, someone advised that it was necessary to cover piles with plastic or a lid or something. What are your thoughts on needing to have some sort of cover for the bin? For the piles, I mean.
Oh, for the pile. So covering compost, you can definitely get in trouble with. Like as far as if your pile is it's that thing where it's out of sight, out of mind. So you'll tend to forget it. And you open the pile and you'll get this horrible ammonia smell and a methane smell. And it's because your pile has gone anaerobic, because a compost pile, it naturally has a air cycle to it, where it's kind of like a wood burning stove in your house, how the stove will pull in the cold air to fuel the fire. And then the heat goes up out of the top of it. Okay. The same thing applies for compost piles, because they can get so hot. They will pull in air, and then there needs to be a way for that hot air to move. And so it creates this cycle, right? Now, if you cover it with a tarp, that cycle isn't going to happen. And your pile is going to start going anaerobic, and it can get really, really hot, and it can get really nasty in there. That's why I was saying, if you have to cover it with a tarp, you want a good 2 feet gap between your tarp and your pile. So that's why you want to cover, put some sort of wire mesh all rolled up in there to keep it covered, so that this air circulation process can still happen in the pile. They do make very fancy material now that breathes, that you can put on a compost pile, and it allows rain to get in and it allows air to go out. So that's something that, composting facilities have been experimenting with, and they like how that works because it will keep, flies and things from getting into your pile. But like I said, properly made compost pile won't have an issue with flies and insects because it's getting to the proper temperature where they can't survive. Like a dog or an animal isn't going to put its nose into 135-degree compost. My dog did that once and then he never did that again. Like he's like, no, I'm not gonna, like, he burned his nose. I mean,
Yeah.
and so the same with bugs, they can't live in that temperature. Um, so, but you can, like you're saying, if you wanted to put like some piece of metal, like if you built a pallet structure around it, and then you want to put a piece of metal on top, like a little roof where there's an air gap, you can totally do that because now you're still allowing airflow and movement to move around your pile. But to completely like put a lid on it, no, because that's you're gonna grow anaerobic bacteria in your compost. And
Yeah.
you're gonna make it smelly. You're gonna give it the bad rep that it has, like where it's smelly.
I wonder if the advice to put a lid over it, I wonder if the person who asked that question remembers if it was like a total cover or if like I wonder if that advice came from living in the city and needing to keep the pile contained. Like perhaps
Mm,
if there was a lid that wasn't complete, like didn't create a total seal around the pile.
mm,
Perhaps I know who gave that advice, and so I'm happy to follow up and get a little bit more clarification.
mm.
Because yeah, I don't know if that came from just the desire to keep it all contained in the city or not.
Yeah. So that is something that we have to think about a lot too, is like, like I was saying, proper composting requires a lot of labor, one can say. I mean, I don't think it requires a lot of labor because I like going out there and checking on it, and I love creating soil from my garden, so I do it. But if you are a composter who really doesn't want to put a lot of effort into it, so there are these composting bins out there now where it's a full plastic bin with air holes in it. And you throw your materials in, throw your nitrogen and your carbon into the compost bin. And then they make these special churners that, you put in there and mix it up. And it looks like it's like sitting in like, like a big plastic pot. I
Mhm.
did experiment with those. And every single time I used it, even when I was turning it every day, and putting as much expertise as I could into it, it would always vector larvae and insects, and it would be smelly, and it did not give me a product that I wanted. It was extremely hard to put the correct amount of, like to get it all covered in like the carbon like you're supposed to on the sides. Because
Mm.
when you're building a compost pile, you cover the whole thing with carbon, right? It's like none of it's exposed. And it's really hard to do that in those bins, even though there's air holes on all the sides. There's food exposed on those sides because you see, how are you going to cover the sides exactly? Like there's techniques. You could put tons of carbon in there and then dig a hole in the center and then put your food waste in there. But now what you've done is now you have a hot core of just nitrogen and
Mhm.
food waste that's going to only grow anaerobic bacteria while the outside is covered in the carbon. And so it's a tricky situation with those bins. We want people to compost more. We don't want their compostables going to the landfill, right? But we don't want them to compost in a way that is open to the environment in case they vector flies or, in case it attracts animals. So the thing that there's some examples of is, that I have on another slide, is you can build a nice pallet system where it has a front to it. So you have the pallet like this guy that's turning. It's a three-sided pallet, two sides and a back is what I like because it's easy access. But you can put a front one on top that you can put on a hinge to open the door, and then you could put a metal thing on top of that. And you could do the same for those big compost systems like at the market garden, right? Where
Mhm.
you could try to create some door. But in those situations, like you would probably just want to cover it with a tarp. But I'm telling you, if you put, it's called a bio layer. If you put
Right.
a bio layer on top of your compost pile, you're not going to have any issues. And a bio layer is 4 to 6 to 8 inches of carbon material over your nitrogen. So it's not that you're not going to be able to have smells come out of that. It's going to be able to protect itself from, from insects. It will not have, you should not have an issue.
Well, follow-up question
Yes.
about covering. Do you think it would be an issue for bird poop to get into it? It sounds
No.
like perhaps they were told that they needed to keep a lid over it to keep the bird poop out.
No. I mean,
Okay.
bird poop, they sometimes have seeds in them, but remember, you're turning your pile. So you are like going to incorporate all of that into the core. And then also bird poop is the same as like, other birds like chickens and stuff, where it's a nitrogen source for your compost pile.
Right.
So
Okay.
you shouldn't
Interesting.
have, I mean, it's the same thing like if a bird were to poop on your garden, right? Like birds poop on your garden all the time. You just wash it off if it's on the food, or you throw that food in the compost pile, or or if they poop on the ground, it's a form of nutrient recycling. So the
Okay.
same thing in compost.
Interesting. Okay. And one more question about turning the compost.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean that you turn it from the bottom to the top? Do you completely flip it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a couple of videos to show you how to properly turn it. So we'll go into those next.
Great.
Okay, thank you for your questions, because the whole covering thing in a city situation is very difficult. It is hard. Like they want people to have their compost completely in a bin, but unless you're going out there 3 times a day and really active with it, it's going to be very hard to keep it from going anaerobic and become
Okay.
smelly.
Gotcha.
So,
Well, one more question going into your turning demonstrations to keep in mind, but once you start turning the pile, can you add more green and browns? So I'll let you
yeah,
answer that as appropriate.
no, that's great. That's really, really great. Thank you. So there's 2 questions to that. I mean, 2 answers to that. If you're a home, I would love to know if whoever said this, if they're a home composter, then there's a certain answer. But if you're a farmer that's farming a large amount of like your feedstock is going to be you're going to do a windrow and you're going to set it all up at once and it's going to be huge, and you turn it, you don't add any more. Like when you go to build your pile and say you have all your materials and you're like, all right, I'm going to build myself a really nice compost pile. I just cleaned my garden. I have my nitrogen and I have my mulch. I'm going to build it up to 3 or 4 feet and it's going to compost. At that point, when you go to turn it in like a few days because it's going to get hot, you do not add any more to it because you just created the perfect ratio and pile. All you're going to do is like, say this is where a 2-bin system, which is what I'm going to show you, is really important. Like, or that video I was trying to talk at the market garden, because what you could do in that situation is you would turn your pile over to your other bin. And now that pile can sit there and keep decomposing while now you've freed up a space for now you can start another pile if you needed to. But say you're a person who's just at home and you want to just go out there and throw your food scraps every once in a while and you're slowly building your pile up. Well, if you're slowly building your pile up over like a few weeks, then yes, you do want to turn your compost pile because you don't want that to sit there for 3 weeks and just get really compacted. So you'll go out there and say you have I create a lot of compost because we eat a lot of vegetables. Just our home composting bin gets high very quickly. So I go out there and I want to turn it every week. And as I'm turning it, I'm looking at to make sure I don't have any anaerobic spots. But also, as I'm turning it, I still will have a lot of like organic material. Like there'll still be food waste because it didn't have the time to decompose properly. It didn't go through that super high, low, which is okay. because by the time I get enough material in there to reach the 3 feet that it needs to be, I still have some of that nitrogen content in there and carbon material to feed it and let it sit there and get warmed up again. Like I'll turn it, I'll water it in, and I'll let it sit there for, you know, a week and or 3 days mostly, and then monitor it, check the temperature, turn it again into the next round. So for the slow builders that are just doing their food scraps at home, yes, you're going to want to go in there and mix it up and turn it. And this is good because if you go into your compost pile at home, like say, you know, you're just slowly throwing things in there, and you go in there and you go to turn it and you're like, oh my gosh, this smells so bad. Then right there, you know that you have not been adding enough carbon material to your compost pile. So you want to get some carbon material, get your leaves and your mulch, and you want to throw it in there to counter how much nitrogen that you have in there. Turn it up and let it sit. And the same can go for nitrogen. If say you haven't produced a lot of food scraps and your pile's only, you know, 2 feet tall, and you're going to go out there to check on it, and all the food scraps are probably gone because you had a lot of nitrogen, a lot of carbon and not a lot of nitrogen. And so you can take your food scraps and you can throw them back into the pile if you still have carbon material present. If you still have lots of wood chips present that you want to break down, then you'll throw some more nitrogen material in there to break down those wood chips. But if you go out there in your pile and you see that your nitrogen's gone, and you see that your wood chips are, you know, somewhat gone, then you should technically have a little pile of compost there. And I would move that to the side and let it cure, or you could start another pile and put that on top of your new pile. So you can keep do the slow composting process where you're kind of like slowly decomposing your organic material. That process is kind of a form of it can be a form of like in between cold and hot, because your pile is still getting hot, but it's not getting hot enough to where it is going to kill off. Like say if you put a bunch of weeds in there, you might not get it hot enough to kill off all those weeds or those seeds. That's when you see like squash or potatoes and stuff growing in the compost pile, which is totally fine. It just means that your pile didn't get hot enough to kill those. So you kind of were in between the hot and cold, but you still will get a finished product from that. And it's still okay. You just might have a little bit of seeds in there. Gotcha. So I hope that helped to answer that question.
Well, any recommendation of what would be best for the community garden settings?
I always think it's best for them to have, like, when they have big work days of like they're gonna come and they're gonna get a lot of weeds all at once, or they're gonna, you know, go and chop down all their tomato plants and clean out a bed. I recommend that you get a huge stockpile of your nitrogen, and then you have a big pile of your carbon, and then you make your one big pile of compost. So you like build it up to 4 or 5 feet, and then, you know, you can, I don't know how active people are in the community gardens, but, you know, you can save your nitrogen. You can put, like, if you go out there, you know, once a week and you pull your weeds and you only have weeds that fill up a 5-gallon bucket, well, then put your weeds, you know, to the side and wait until you get, like, maybe next week you'll have enough weeds to like build your pile up to 3 feet. So you can wait over time to collect your nitrogen source and then add it in, especially in Missouri, because it won't dry out as fast there. So like,
great. Those are all our questions on that for right now, but that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear this video or no?
I cannot.
Okay, then I'll just turn it down. Okay. So this video I was going to show you is a video of me not turning my compost pile because it got away from me and I was too busy, which happens in mom life all the time. What I'm showing you in this video right here is anaerobic bacteria. So if you can see those little white specks all over that pot, all over the leaf and the mulch material, when I opened up that compost pile, it was not a very pleasant smell because it had turned a little bit anaerobic. But the great thing about this is that, see, that it wasn't too much. Like the anaerobic material did take over the carbon material. But what I did was we turned the pile, we watered it down because it was very dry. And we gave it a lot more oxygen. And then I went back out there in a few days, and the aerobic bacteria had taken over. So you can defeat the anaerobic bacteria when you incorporate oxygen because they can't survive in an oxygen setting. So as soon as you open it up and you give them oxygen, they will die. And then the good guys will come in and take over. So just know that if your pile accidentally has a bad odor or goes anaerobic, you can save it by turning it and making sure it has the correct moisture content, and then checking on it again in a couple of days. So I just want to give you an example there of what anaerobic bacteria looks like in a compost pile. So if a compost pile has bad odor, it's too tight, it could be too wet, it's growing anaerobic bacteria, like I said, or the mixture is off. If the pile is not composting, then it's most likely that you need to add some moisture to it, and you possibly need to add nitrogen to it, or carbon, depending on the smell. And then if the pile is not hot, and if you're trying to achieve a hot compost pile, then it could be too small, or you don't have enough nitrogen in it. So one thing with troubleshooting your compost pile is that you want to do one thing at a time. So when I went out there and my compost pile had a bad odor, I turned it. I was like, okay, we got to turn this. So that's the first thing we did. And then I looked at it again and I said, okay, it's way too dry, which it was. So then we added water while we were turning. And that's okay. We stopped right there. We don't want to do anything else. Now, if your compost pile is not composting, it may need moisture, right? You go in there and you say, okay, I still see my nitrogen, I still see my food waste, and I still see my carbon, but none of it's composting. So add water first, and then walk away and come back in a couple of days and see how it's doing. If it's still not doing well, then add more nitrogen. But I really like to recommend that you do like one thing at a time, unless you know exactly what's wrong with it, like I did in this video. Because if you end up doing too many solutions to your problem, then you never know what was the solution to your problem. You know, like you want to do one thing at a time, so you can it kind of helps you figure out the rhythm of your compost pile by doing one solution at a time. Okay. Now, saprophytic fungi. I had to put these guys in here because in Missouri, you will see these in your compost pile and if you use mulch. Even if you use straw sometimes, these are the good guys. Please be happy. Be like, you can just like do a celebration dance if you have saprophytic fungi in your compost pile, because these guys help to break down carbon material into soil. They live on the surface, and they live around carbon materials, and you can literally watch them break it down into compost. It's absolutely beautiful. So when you come across these in your compost pile, you want to be really delicate with them because they're delicate. You could shred them up, and then it makes the process slow down quite a bit. So you don't want to do that. So what I do when I come across them is I kind of gather them up in a little pile. I'll turn my compost pile, and then I'll put them back in there to continue growing. So just keep an eye out for them and be really happy when you have these present, especially if you have these present in your garden too. They're very good for your garden as well. Okay, composting styles. So we're going to talk about static aerated, windrow, 3-bin, and hardware cloth. And I want to make sure I don't go over time here, so I'm going to keep going. The image in here is a windrow style on a farm that you can see right there. Okay, so static aerated piles. This is going to be more geared towards farmers. This is a solution for composting that does not require turning. So it's less labor intensive. It does require a little bit more upfront costs, as you will need to buy the PVC piping, end caps, the blower, a little shelter for your blower, and you're going to need mulch, and you're going to need electricity. But what this does is you build your pile on top of these PVC pipes, and then you blow, or you can suck out, but either one, blow air into the pile, which keeps the pile anaerobic. One thing you want to do if you do this style is that you really want to make sure to put a nice layer of mulch over the pipes before you start building, because the mulch layer that is over the pipe, like you want to put like a 1 foot mound over these pipes so that when it pushes out the air, it's scattering it all throughout the pile instead of just pushing it out in one direction, which can happen if you put nitrogen on, if you just directly put your feedstock on top of it. So same thing applies with this. Nice layer of mulch, and then you layer in your systems. You got your layer of food, you got your layer of mulch, layer of food, layer of mulch. Pile it up until you reach 4 feet high minimum, 6 feet high maximum. And then you cover. You have to cover the entire pile with a bio cover. So with mulch or leaves or a type of cover that's breathable. And then you let it sit there. And you let it sit there for, a month, and you come out and check on it. And you also want to take its temperature. You can have blower. So the blower too, the blower doesn't run constantly. You got to put the blower on some sort of timer, or you got to manually turn it on and off. Big composting facilities are moving more towards static aerated because they don't have to have heavy equipment, machinery that turns the pile. But it requires, really good timers. Some people do like a 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off all day. Other people will do, a little bit longer stint, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. So it does require, electricity use. But a great, fast, and effective way to make compost is static aerated. You can do something very similar to this in a small pile too, if you wanted. Like if you wanted to do a backyard composting with pallets, you could stick a PVC pipe with holes in it. And you can you have a little blower, like say your leaf blower, and you could blow air through that pipe every once in a while too, which would be really good for your compost pile. So you can adapt this to smaller piles. Like at the community gardens, this would be a great solution for the community gardens because your pile should almost never smell because you're forcing air through it all the time. So it's always going to be aerobic. Like you're not going to have any stinky thing. So this is something that for the community gardens, like their farming sites, it'd be really cool to see them invest in something like this. Okay, windrow style. Now this is more for farmers and in the ag world. This is where you're going to do a bigger pile. And I actually started out doing windrow composting when I was first doing the collection service and making my own, like processing my own food scraps from that. You add your fresh ingredients on, like if you're just doing one windrow, you add your fresh ingredients on one side and you slowly build it down until you reach the length that you want. And then that pile's done. And then you go to another one and slowly build it down. With this style though, you have to have a tracking system. Like you have to have a notebook and paper, and you have to label each windrow, and you have to date it, and you have to keep track of when you turned it, when you started it, so you don't mix all that up because it's really important that you keep track of how often you turn it. Is best with tractors. You can do it manually. I manually turned like 4 windrows for a very long time. It was a lot. It was very labor intensive, but you can do it. Or they make components now that you can buy and put on your tractor to turn your windrow pile. And you remember what I said at the very beginning, these implements will pay themselves off because compost is so expensive. If you are trucking in compost for your farm every year at, $1,500 to $3,500, that component right there is going to pay itself off over time. Plus, if you start making compost like crazy, you know, and you're a farm that's outside city limits, you could start, you know, selling it or giving it away to other farmers too. So investing in a small windrow turner that applies water, which is like that little one attached to the tractor, I personally think is a good investment if you have a large farm and you make a lot of green material. So this is the open bin system. So this is like what you would do in your backyard. And this is like what the community gardens does at their market garden, right? You can make it look really nice, like that top one. And the one that's the one with this just the two turner, you know, they don't have to be this ugly thing. It can look very inviting. So this is my favorite style. I've been teaching this style for many, many years, and I myself use this style on my farm. And this is what I recommend. It provides really great airflow. It provides easy access to turning your compost pile and checking it. There's a little example of some cinder block ones too, if you didn't want to use wood. I will say that they have been testing cinder blocks now recently, and the chemicals that they're using to make these are not the greatest. So just know that the wood that you choose to use for and the chemicals that you choose to surround your compost pile will have an effect on your compost pile. When I use pallets, I try to get untreated pallets, because if you get chemically treated pallets, over time those chemicals leach into the soil and they will kill the microorganisms in the soil. So you won't get the greatest product. So just know that, you know, trying to get something that doesn't have a lot of chemicals in it that won't leach into your pile is the best thing for your compost, because it's alive.
Hey, Justine, that's a great tip, because I've seen so many compost systems using pallets. Is there a reliable way to check or to tell if they're treated or not?
Yes, I should have put that in here. There's a little tree, it looks like a little Christmas tree on the pallet that said, and it has an HT, and that means that it's heat treated. Those are safe. Any other, yeah, those are what you want to look for. A little tree that says HT for heat treated. And it will be stamped on the pallet. And then any pallet that has paint on it, obviously you don't want to use, that's, you know, has chemicals on it. And then other, like they will have other like stamps on them for other, like to say what they were treated with too. So in Missouri, when I was looking at in Springfield trying to find pallets, a lot of them, they would label them HT, so you knew that they were heat treated. Okay, hardware cloth composting. This one is awesome. This is my second favorite. And we did a demonstration at the market garden a few years back with creating one of these. It is your fastest option for a finished compost pile for like a backyard composter or a market garden composter. And this is also composters who make really high-end compost for like compost tea, or like boutique compost is becoming a thing now. This is the method they will use to make compost, because it guarantees really good oxygen flow. It guarantees the correct height in the compost pile, and you can see your layering system inside to make sure that you are layering it correctly, and it allows for good moisture. Plus, it's really easy to turn, and I'll show you how that's done. And it helps to keep the critters out. Like a dog can't get inside that. You can put a little, you can even put hardwood cloth over the top of that, and a dog's not going to get inside. Hardwood cloth is a little bit expensive, so that's the only downfall to this one. So here is a video of how to make this. Oh, let's turn it down. Here is a video of us making a hardwood cloth composting pile many years ago. So you can see that one thing I wanted to point out with here is we had a lot of green materials when we made this. Like they had stockpiled all their tomato cuttings and excuse me, other cuttings that they had done. Like they just did a garden clean out, so they had a lot of green material to get rid of. And they Also, I had like their dried weeds, they had mulch, they had some finished compost. And so what Drew is doing here is he's layering it in and he's measuring it in that tote, which is another thing you can do. So we would put all the green material in that tote and throw it in. Then we also did food scraps. So they put a bunch of food scraps in that tote and then throw it in. And then he put mulch in that tote and he threw it in. So he knew how much, he made sure each layer was very similar. And that straw that we use, we were sure to wet the straw before we put it in there because it was extremely dry and we didn't want, sometimes when you put really dry straw into a compost pile, it will like suck all the moisture into it and your pile will get really dry very quickly. And then she's making sure to add in water at every layer, like that diagram in the beginning was showing you. And then they're inoculating it with their finished compost right there. She put a shovel of her finished compost in there to inoculate it with the microorganisms. And so they're going to do this all the way until they got rid of all of their garden materials this way. So you can see, you know, he's not putting a super large amount of wood chips in there because it's such a high carbon material. I never got a video or an upgrade, like a check-in on how this compost pile went. I'm hoping it went well. So yeah, so they're shoving it in that bin to measure it to make sure it's not too much, throwing it in, moving it around. So moving it around and making sure that it's flat is really important. Like you don't want this big mound because every time you add to it, then you're just adding to the mound. And so you always want to make when you're building your compost pile, you want to make it nice and flat. Each layer nice and flat so that by the time you get up to 4 feet, you have this nice square, which can be kind of difficult in composting because you'll find yourself, you know, as you're adding it, you'll find yourself creating this mound, which is okay. As long as that mound, the top of it is, you know, 4 feet, you're fine. So, but you really want to start out with it as flat as you can. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. And then you can see in this video, you can start seeing the layers here. You see the straw layer, you see a green layer, you see the mulch layer, straw layer, green layer, mulch. This is what we're looking for in compost. We want to see these layers because microorganisms will move throughout these layers and start, and also provides nice oxygen pockets for the microorganisms as well. So. And when you're building compost pile, you know, try to get some friends to help you because it's so much nicer when you have, you know, when it's more than one person doing it. Ta-da! That's how you do a hardwood cloth compost pile build. Okay. We're on to our next section, and we had a little bit of technical difficulties here, so I'm going to come back over here and stop sharing so that you guys can watch these videos now. Okay.
Yeah, I gotcha. All right.
Product compost is one of the hardest ones to convey over video and Zoom. I really like people to be in person to experience the compost because it has an aroma and a texture and a color that you really want to see in person to know of whether or not it's the best quality. But I will try my best to get it through this video. So welcome to my farm here, one of the composting areas behind me. On my farm, we do still hand sift our compost with this sifter. It does take some time, but it's what we have at the moment. So the finished product that you're going to get on your farm and with you making it from your own farm material is going to be of a better quality than what you can buy at most places. This is because it allows earthworms and microbes that are native to your soil the native to your land to inoculate your compost so that it will best be ready for when you go to apply it onto your farm. I'm going to show you the compost that I have. I'm going to show you the texture that you're looking for, the color that you're looking for, and show you a little bit about moisture content as well. And then I'm going to walk you around to some other compost that I got delivered this year to show you different qualities of compost from compost makers and what to look for when you're looking for a finished product from a compost maker and what you're not looking for. Finished compost, if you're going to purchase it from a producer, you definitely want to ask them lots of questions as far as what their feedstock is going in, that they're using to go into the compost, the temperatures that it reached. You want to talk about contamination when it comes to plastics and glass. And you want to talk about, you could ask them when it was made. And then lastly, you would want to ask to see their sheets of compost analysis. And we can discuss a little bit further about how to read compost analysis and what that means for your land. So I'm going to show you my compost that I have here and try to describe the texture and smell to you. Get it. Okay, so the compost quality that you want as far as color is you're going for a 70% dark chocolate bar. You do not want black. Black is a sign of anaerobic bacteria in the compost. And when you make homemade compost, it's very hard to get it to be black. So just know that another reason why you want to be composting on your farm. So right here, you can see that we have reached that 70% dark chocolate bar color. Also in my compost right now is some earthworms. You can see them, there they are. Okay, so now you're getting earthworm casting in your compost, which is wonderful. And then you have some other little bugs that are moving around inside the compost as well, which is good because it's keeping it, they're allowing air flow as they're moving around. So one thing that my compost is it is a little dry. So when we go to lift it up here, it's a little crumbly. This section here is a little bit more dry, you could see. So I do want to water this compost, this finished product. There is a section here that when we squeeze it in my hand, it will stay formed. And that's what we're looking for. We want to squeeze it really hard and still hold its form. If I were to squeeze this super hard, I would want to actually see like 1 drop of water or 2 drops of water coming out, because even in your finished product, you want it to stay moist. It's very important for the moisture in your finished product to be there, because there's microorganisms in here that are moving around and they're still active. And when it dries out, they can die or they can go dormant. And sometimes when you rehydrate your compost, they will come back and sometimes they won't. So I like to just keep it at the right moisture, which is like a wrung out sponge. And it tends to keep the compost alive in a better place. You can see there's still some eggshells in here, which I like. And then if you smell it, it's very earthy. which is what we're looking for. We want the compost to have an aroma and to have an earthy and like healthy aroma. If you smell compost and there's no aroma there, then it means that your microorganism content is probably going to be very low. Your organic material content is going to be very low in that compost as well. So yes, this is what we're looking for when we're looking for healthy compost. So
go ahead and play the second one. You're going to see 3 different types of compost in these videos that are on my farm. So
just a second. Let me get it back.
And I see the other question about how do we turn the hardwood cloth. I have a video that I'm going to show you right after this about how you turn that.
So I've come over to my compost pile that I got delivered this year from a commercial composter. This came from a composting facility that composts turkey waste. And it is a pretty good compost. It is a little bit more on the expensive side. I think they're anywhere between $65 to $75 a yard. So another reason why you would want to, start composting on your own, because that can get very expensive, especially if you have a large market garden like I do, where you're going to need many yards of compost to get a nice top dress. So I could show you some of the things that you should not do with compost while you're storing it, which is allow it to dry out. And we have allowed it to dry out here. And so now it's turned into, it's very dusty now. But the good thing about this compost is that it does have a lot of organic matter in it. So it rehydrates really well. And I just rehydrated some here for you so I could show you. Bring it up a little bit closer. So this is the dry. This is rehydrated. And another way to show that you have good compost is that it has the ability to rehydrate. And so I just rehydrated it, and I'm going to squeeze it here. You can see a few drops coming out. It's holding its structure, which is good. You also see organic matter and soil aggregates in this soil, just like you could see in the soil that I make here on the farm. This one is on the dark side. You can see this backing of this is black, painted black, and you can see how this is almost on the too dark side. So this probably got a little bit more anaerobic than it should have, but I was happy with its water holding abilities so quickly. Because what can happen with compost that gets dried out is that it can start to repel water. Where I don't know if you've ever come across compost that you purchased where you pour water on it and then it instantly comes off. It becomes hydrophobic. And that is a sign of poor compost. What's happening is it doesn't have any organic matter in the compost to hold water. And remember, compost should have the ability to hold 5 times its weight in water. So when you come across compost that can't hold water or repels it, it instantly should be a warning sign to you that this is not good compost, and you don't want to spend your money on that. So again, here's, where I am, this is the best that I can find. And so if I want to buy commercial compost, this is what I will buy. I will be storing this better. I need to come out here and hydrate it. And then I will be putting a tarp over it. I'll put a rolled up chicken wire on top, and then I'll hydrate it and throw a tarp over this so that the sun stops baking it and drying it out. Because as you can see where I am in California, we do not get water from the end of May until November. And so we really have to be cautious with our water use, and we have to do special things to survive the summer here. And one of them is applying compost on our beds as much as we can. So this is a good example of, two dried compost, like I was saying, but it has the ability to rehydrate, which is really great. It has organic matter in it that you can see, which, let's see if I can get you a handful here. That's bringing it up to the camera. I can see the mulch in there. I can even see like the dried out soil particles. The contamination of this compost is really low. There is absolutely no plastic or metals or glass in this whatsoever, which is really excellent. That's what you're looking for. Yeah. And when I purchased this from this facility, I asked for their compost analysis. I looked it over, and then I asked them what their feedstock was. And then they told me, it was just their turkey bedding mixed with forest litter here where I am in California. That's very common. And mulch. So, this is a pretty good product. Okay, now I'm going to take you over to a compost that I got that was very poor quality, so you can see what that looks like. So now I am at a compost pile where I had just moved to my farm and I needed to purchase compost quickly so I could get my farm started. And I didn't have time to make my own. And the facility that I wanted to purchase it from was already out of compost. So I took a risk and I purchased from a very distant city where I could not go and see the compost. I called them and asked for a compost analysis, and what they had showed on their analysis was fine. But when it arrived, it was not fine. This compost was highly contaminated with all different types of plastics, plastic bags. It even had like socks, and unfortunately, it did have glass and metal, which is the worst thing that a compost pile can have. And so this compost, you will be able to tell a difference. And I wanted to hydrate it for you, but I also realized that this compost is near impossible to hydrate unless I put it in a wheelbarrow and put water in it and let it sit overnight, which shows you the another like very bad sign of compost. And so I'll kind of show you this right here. I'm gonna pour water on this, and you can see right now, like look at this. This compost looks very sandy. See, it doesn't have barely any organic matter. And actually there's a piece of glass right there. And you could see kind of how dusty it is when I drop it. It's not good at all. When compost looks like sand, that's not a good sign. It has been turned way too many times at that point with their machinery. And every time you turn compost, you're breaking up the fungal strands, and you're also killing microorganisms. And so you are basically shredding everything to death. And so it can turn into this sandy, dusty material from being turned too much with machinery. That's another thing you want to be cautious of in your compost. You don't want to turn it too much or aggravate it too much. So let me show you what it looks like when we put water onto a compost that's hydrophobic and a very poor quality. You can see this here. So what instantly happens is it pulls up. Right? I have like this little flood that's happening here. By the way, And you might see some appearance from my chickens because this pile is in my chicken pasture. And then it does absorb over time. But it takes a very, very long time to absorb a decent amount of compost. So this is not what I'm looking for whatsoever. And then when you do, this is another good sign, and I'm glad that this area actually absorbed in, is I want to show you that when it does get wet, now what's happened is it's become this, it turns into clay basically. And I'm going to show you this here. This ball right here is very, very clayey now, okay? And it breaks apart in these big like chunks. And that's not what we're looking for. We want it to be able to crumble itself naturally and not turn into clay. Because it's extremely small, almost sand-like particles, is that it acts like sand whenever we get it wet. And this is not what we're looking for. And then as far as the color, this one will be as dark as this is the darkest compost that I have. When it showed up, it was basically black, and I knew right away that from that wasn't going to work when it's black. So after this absorbs in here in a second, and again, you can see how slow the absorption rate is here. I want to take this and put it on our little piece of wood here, so you can see how this one is acting. So picking it up, it's very clay-like, putting it over here. Okay. So now this is what we have on the board now, which is a good example. Okay, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about as far as it's acting like wet sand or wet clay, which is not what we want. See that? And then the color of this one, which it might be hard to see on camera, but it is extremely dark. It's all like, it may have a little bit of brown in it, but it's almost the same color as this black board. But see how this is moving when it's wet? Right? Not very pleasant at all. So this is what you want to watch out for. You do not want compost like this. You do not want to purchase compost like this either. All right, so that's going to be it for our finished product section. Now, please let me know if you have any questions.
I'm going to share my screen how to get back to the presentation. Yeah, no, sorry, the videos they were kind of choppy and didn't work. I'm going to try to upload them to YouTube so people can have them as well. One thing that, oh my gosh, it did not load in here, huh? Well, I did have a video to show you how to turn that, to turn the cage, but it looks like it did not, something happened, it didn't make it in here. I am so sorry about that. I could describe it to you. Let me go back over here a little bit.
And is that to help answer the question about the hardware cloth?
Yes.
Okay.
How do you turn it? Let me show you, show you this way. Okay. So this hardware cloth right here, it is held together by bungee cords. So what you're going to do, like once you take the temperature of it, in this type of style of composting, it will get hot really quickly. And what you're going to do is when it reaches 165, if you notice that starting to go over, or you've reached your like 3-4 day limit of this temperature, you're going to take off those bungee cords and you're going to open the hardware cloth back up and you're going to peel it off of the compost pile. And you'll notice that the compost pile just stays standing up exactly how it's supposed, like exactly how you made it. And I'm so sorry my video didn't make it in here of turning it. So then you take that and then you just turn you take the hardware cloth and you set it up right next to your pile. And you set it up right next to it, and then you put it back together again. And you peel the outside layer off first. And you'll see like the outside layer all the way around the top and on the sides. And you take that outside layer and you put it to the side. And then you're left with the core layer. And then you take that core layer and you put that to the other side. And then you have the bottom layer. So now you have your 3 layers. You have your core layer, your bottom layer, and your outside layer. So the first thing you're going to do is in your new hardware cloth that you just set up is you're going to take your outside layer and you're going to put it in the bottom. And then you're going to take the bottom layer and you're going to sprinkle it all around that. And then you're going to take your core layer, and you're going to put it all around that. So basically, how you properly turn a compost pile is you take it and you flip it inside out so that the center of the pile goes to the outside of the pile, and the outside of the pile goes to the inside of the pile. And you're distributing the microorganisms that way, especially the really, really active ones, because your pile goes through this stage of heat where it goes up slowly and then down and up slowly and down. And at each of those stages, there's different types of microorganisms. So when you're flipping it inside out, now you put the hot on the outside to cool off, and you have the cold microorganisms on the inside. So all your hot microorganisms are going to move to the center to start decomposing that new stuff that just got put in the center again, and to warm your pile up again. By flipping it inside out like this, you're making sure that all these different types of microorganisms are touching all the material. And also you're making sure that your material is getting hot. All your material is reaching to 160 degrees or 150 degrees. You'll notice that when you turn it, you'll come back and it will have gone back up again, because now you've introduced new material, new nitrogen, new carbon to the compost pile. So you'll see it go back up again, and then it will go back down. And then you're going to want to turn it again after that. And you kind of just keep turning it, as you're monitoring it, until it turns into that finished product that I showed you in that first video. And with a hardware cloth composting, that will happen very quickly. So I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions, if there's any more questions, and turning it. There's some really great diagrams online, and I had one on here, but now it's not in my PowerPoint, of flipping your compost inside out. Okay, so applying it to your garden. 2 to 4 inch layer to garden beds is the most ideal. If you're using compost to suppress weeds in your garden, which I highly recommend because it will do that, you want to use a minimum of 4 inches of compost to suppress weeds. I practice no-till in my farm. And so what we do instead is this year when I built everything up, in the beginning of the season, we have a frame that's a 4-inch frame that makes our beds, and we just pile our compost up in that frame until it reaches the top, and we move our frame to the next bed and pile it up until it reaches the top. And the only weeds that I had in those beds were ones that distribute themselves through the air, that float around the air that you have no control of. I don't have weeds popping up from underneath the ground. And then application to the field. If you're a farmer, you can get a compost spreader that will blow out the compost onto your field, which I definitely recommend. There's multiple research studies that have shown that when you just apply 1-inch layer of compost to your ag fields, how much water holding capacity and carbon you sequester in your fields after you do that is immense. And the improvement that you have. When you do this though, when you apply it to your field, you have to make sure that you have a compost of good quality. If you need to either make it yourself, or you need to purchase it from a company where you've seen their compost, you have looked at the compost analysis, and you can guarantee that you're going to have a good product. I have a friend, his name is Troy. His company is Living Roots Compost, and he will do a compost analysis for you under a microscope. Well, he'll look at the soil organisms and make sure that it's alive, and he'll do a soil microorganism count for you. His information is right there, Living Roots Compost Tea. Troy, we did a compost tea workshop for the community gardens together, so you can go on their website, on their YouTube channel, and you can see that workshop if you want to learn more about compost tea. He is an absolute expert in his field. He recently got paid by grant. He won a grant to go to Jamaica and teach them how to compost in Jamaica properly. He is like a top expert in this country, and I definitely recommend his compost that he makes and his teas, and the knowledge that he has. So, okay, what time is it? I know we're getting close. Oh, it's 6 o'clock exactly. Oh my goodness. Oh, 8 o'clock your time. Sorry, 8 o'clock exactly your time. That was a lot of information. It always is a lot of information. So please feel free to go back and rewatch this or watch any of the other videos, and ask. And also feel free to ask me any questions now if you have time, you want to stay, or you can always email me at justine@sgfcompost.org. That's our website. And then Troy at Living Roots Compost Tea as well. So do we have any questions?
It doesn't look like it, but we do have a raffle to call. So we've got that. Thank you to everyone who stuck around. That's wonderful. I wrote down the names of all of our attendees who came throughout the night. I know sometimes not everyone can stay the whole time. So we're doing it the old-fashioned way, pulling names from a hat.
Yeah. Hopefully we can. Did you get their email? Did they give you they give you their email? Yeah.
When they register, we've got their info. So.
Okay.
La 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 la, the lucky winner. Aw, one of our garden leaders, Susan. So I will make sure
yay.
Get her address from you and we can connect and get that. Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Justine. These are, like I said, some of our most popular workshops, very high demand for learning about composting because it can be so intimidating to people, but you make it really easy. And thank you for being so available and giving with your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Thank you for being here. I enjoy it as well.
All right. You guys have a nice night.
Okay. Bye.
Take care.